Um, Good morning. My name is Mark Richards. Thanks for coming. Today we're going to talk about talent management. And in fact, actually, we'll talk about is really the process to get ready for talent management. And John actually was a great straight man, I think, to start today with talking about when he and I talked about putting this together. It was really taking one finance professional's experience and sharing it. So very similar to what the premise of Performative was. So it's not a high-level strategy, but really about kind of the nuts and bolts a little bit about getting ready. And so, when I think of talent management, it is, you've got a team here and you want to take them over here. And obviously when you take them over here, it has to be aligned up to the business. And no matter what process you use in the middle, that intent or goal is really the same. And so there's a variety of ways to do that. And so, when I started in my first round and having to go through a big talent management process I sat down with a colleague of mine she led our HR team, and she said, I don't need to know finance, I just need to know you. And she followed it by saying that, look, that I understand the role, but I don't necessarily understand all the particular nuances and what's important to deliver. So that's where you have to come in. And so I guess my conclusion was that, look, HR leads talent management, but finance leads HR to where to take our talent. And so it's all about the content that we provide and have to get ready. So no matter what the process in talent management that you use, you still have to be ready to deliver that content to them. And I thought this was a great lead for me. So now, why am I here? I was saying last night at the reception, I think I hit the trifecta because I'm a finance professional. That's my background. I've been on the advisory board of Performative since 2009, in particular writing around careers, networking, job search. And then lastly, after I got slated to do this speech, I actually found out that it was going to be sponsored. SAP was a sponsor, and I actually work for SAP, so I think I hit the trifecta there. But I think I'm like many of you. I have a lot of different background in finance, have managed different teams kind of remotely, both local, remote, international, and have gone through several iterations of talent management as like anyone that leads a team. Like I said, one of the things that I've done within Performative is I've actually been able to create a number of tools around people helping them look at their own talent, and we've had a number of the tools that I've created have had probably like 30,000 downloads on my own site. My blogs at Performative have been, I guess I'm like 80,000 reads, which is totally shocking to me. And now my current role is actually, I think it's a little bit of a dream job for me. I moved into SAP Cloud for Money. And so I spend all my time working with finance people, working with the financial system. But the bonus is I don't have to go through month-end close anymore. So I won't bore you anything with that. There's a colleague of mine, Neil Krefsky, will be giving a presentation at 1 if you're more interested in that. They'll be talking about the cloud and financials. So our role in the alignment of team to the business. And I love this cartoon because it always reminds me of like there's a finance person, the operations, and the business in the middle. Actually, this cartoon is from a divorce cartoon, and the tagline to this is, "Per our agreement, you'll clean up." And so I always felt that way with finance. Sometimes I always felt like I was cleaning up behind the business, right? But there's always going to be a strategy. That's always true. And you start with the strategy of the company and where do you want to go. But then really, you get in again the tacticals. And so I think part of our objective when you do talent management is doing the purpose yourself of visualizing where the business is going to go and then mapping it back into finance. And in particular, what you have to identify is, and then when I say skills, but property skills and experience that you need, and thinking about what you're going to need going forward, but then where do you stand today? And then lastly, how do you then, from your perspective, again, irrespective of what the process is that you use to do it, where do you think that you're going to need to build your team, or through career planning or training, if you would, or by hiring people in? And so my objective today is really just to share with you kind of a process that I built for myself to solve this problem. And ironically, I've probably used it for, I don't know, like 3 or 4 different companies I've worked for, but ironically, I was chair of FENG in Minneapolis for about 5 years, and so through that, got to know, I've probably met, I don't know, probably 100 recruiters, and I don't know how many fellow CFOs, but have actually ended up sharing this with some other fellow CFOs that have put it to use, so which I thought was pretty cool. So putting the plan in action, I think, actually Tom said it today, just said it about keeping things simple. I think your first reaction when you go through this process and start building the content it's just like taking the test. The first answer that you come up with is best. Same thing here. You'll know your team, you know your business. I generally like when I've done it each time I've started the role, but I've always brought in especially my direct reports to get doing just from, it gave me their perspective. Their background was different than my own, so they would see things I wouldn't in particular, which I really found where I had blind spots. But also just share the workload, which I think is good to get it done. Relative to the workload, there were different tools and systems we could leverage to get things done, like assessments, et cetera. So the key there is the less manual work you do, the better off you're going to be as well. And what I present here today, look at it as a starter. If you have a process today, use this as a way to look at it to decide if maybe there's something else you can add to it. If you don't have a process at all for getting ready to get ready through talent management, then this might be something that you can use, okay? And these presentations and such will be available on the site and then at the end I'll give you my email. I'd be happy to chat with anybody. So visualizing the business. I always think of this as talking like an operator. In like one of my earliest jobs, I worked for the CEO of a company, and he said, if you ever want your finance counsel to me to be relevant, you have to be able to think and act like an operator. And his encouragement to me was to get out into the business and go visit. He said, go buy our product, go listen to the sales pitch, go. So I ended up spending quite a bit of time on the road, and actually subsequently the roles that I've always been in have been a little bit more attached in the field and operations, and so I've been really fortunate that I think I've probably I'm up to 14 countries and about 135 cities for work, which is for finance is a little atypical. I think the biggest challenge for me when I was doing this, and I think all of us probably lead to this, is that if you look at the CFO surveys, it says that we generally spend half our time getting everything done to get compliant financial statements together. And so that leaves us a lot less time to be in the business. You're thinking about what the business is doing. So for me, the first step was just committing time to the discovery. So I knew when the talent management process was going to start, so I would just put time on my calendar and start planning it out. And my goal when I went out and started doing my discovery was two things. First, confirm what I knew, or perhaps update what I already knew, and then learn. And the three things that I was really looking for was where was the business heading, kind of the path that they needed to go, what needed to get done. And then lastly, how did you measure the success, especially along the way, right? Because yes, you want to take a business from 50 million to 100 million. Okay, I get the end goal, but what are the things that we need to do along the way? I mean, I guess I always think it's like Google Map. Here I am today, here's where I want to go, how long is it supposed to take me there? That's my measure of success, right? And so in the upcoming slides, what I did is I had a series of discovery questions that I used to go out into the business and talk to them and basically go out and effectively interview, or if you would, or talk to sales, product management, IT, marketing, whoever fit kind of the area that I needed to. And it took perhaps sometimes maybe more than one or two conversations to really get it. And then again, depending on how many divisions, you could separate that with your team. But so I just separated out. So the first one is really what I call phase 1A. So I break the first one down into two parts. But what should we sell? And really, this is all about, what is the need that you're really, the value proposition of the product that you're going to sell, right? What's the need in the market that you're trying to fulfill? What's the solution that you're going to offer when you get out there? What's the business model? How do you make money? Tom talked about that today, looking at the business model itself. What makes your solution special? And then what intellectual capital do you have? What do you have today? What do you build? How do you continue to build it? Many times, actually, I found it interesting. Intellectual capital is something that you may have it started, but a lot of it is the building of it once you get it there. I mean, if you think of LinkedIn, a lot of its intellectual capital is its membership today, very similar performative. And so as I went and talked to people, I would say, figure out what is the things that are near term. There's not a company in the world that doesn't have immediate issues that they have to deal with, right? And then I'd also talk about the future. And so example is I was working with a buddy of mine, and we were going through this together, and he was at a manufacturing firm, and they were also then considering looking at putting a service business so they had a better control around the future delivery after they deliver their product, to have better control of taking care of it. So the near term was they had specific things for the product they had to build, but the longer term view for them was that they were now going to build a service business around the manufacturing business, right? And so that'd be kind of an example of kind of near term future. So when you think about the solution, the one thing I'll just, what I've discovered in this, again, just practical experiences, your solution might be more than a product. So don't always think of solution as a specific single product. It could be a suite of products that you have to deliver to a customer. The benefit of being in finance is we generally have a very pragmatic mind. So as you go out, make this like you're doing a business plan. Look for specifics, clarifying questions. Try and figure out where the dots don't connect. I mean, for me, when I listen to people, I always put it between here's what I believe and here's what I need to believe. And what I need to believe is where I spend my time with all my questions, okay? And then, again, making sure you're asking kind of how do they find what's the success. And again, some of it's financial, some of it's not, some of it's client acceptance, et cetera. And then if you've got multiple divisions, this is where you would divide it up with your team. So once I kind of filled in this, then the next step for me on this grid would be talking about finance, how do I support it, right? And then the skills that I would need. And this is the mapping between where the business is going and what I think. And so I just would start, and literally I would just start with, and this is again where your intuitive response is probably the best, I just would start cataloging all the things that I would need to do around whether it's planning, analysis, KPIs, process, risk, et cetera. I would just catalog all the items relative to each one. I'd indicate kind of which were near term, far term. So going back to the example of the service business, as I was talking, was this colleague and I were talking through it. He was looking at it and saying, okay, now if I'm going to support a service business, I'm going to have rev rec around projects. I'm going to have someone that's looking at staff utilization, staffing, et cetera, a whole different plan in terms of what they have in the house today. And then, the next step was, all right, if you're building kind of the dream team of what you need, what are the skills and experiences required to deliver that, right? And I always indicated kind of what's near term versus future, because that'll come into your plan around whether you can hire or train for this. But ultimately, that was the objective that we tried to work ourselves towards, was just to get this grid filled in, spend time in the field, and then as in our kind of initial response. And I'll bring it to the end in terms of how you process it at the end. The second phase for me was all about how you sell. How should we sell to it? So it's what's the client market that you're going to? What's your target client? What are the right clients for you, right? Oftentimes I found that in some of the businesses I've been in, and particularly I've done a couple of years in startups, that picking the right customer is almost as important as offering the right solution. What's the target market? What geographic market are you going through? And in my current role, one of the big issues we're studying is we've got a software and we're trying to determine which countries are the best countries for us to localize it in. So obviously localizing a finance product in a local market is pretty complex. So trying to understand what that is. From a sales and marketing perspective, what channels do you want to use? Are you going to sell it direct? Will you sell it through partners? Will you sell it through resellers? Again, it's very similar to kind of where you look at Tom's IHOP example, where you could own it directly or go through franchisees, however you want to do that. And then I always look at the advocates as, these are companies or people that want you to succeed along with, so your success leads to their success. It'd be someone that maybe is like an implementator, someone that does an implementation of your product for you after you sell it, right? Or it could be someone that has a complementary product that, again, if you succeed, they succeed. But they can have a big influence on how your business, but also depending on the level of relationship from a financial standpoint, there may be processes or controls, et cetera, that you're going to need. And then lastly, looking at the competition, just understanding, as you see, everything you've heard up to now is really, quite frankly, really what we want to do. But now putting it up against kind of where your competition stands and determining whether or not, I always just say, my question here is, are we kidding ourselves? And so sometimes, this becomes the best reality check. So as you get into this, the one thing I would note that I found was thinking about it when you go filling in kind of your finance support and the skills needed, it was starting to wonder whether or not you need to do any specialization by a given product or a geography. Will you need somebody in country if you're going to be expanding or not? And then if you need somebody to manage the sales channel, depending on how complex it is. So again, going back to my example with my buddy, that when it came to the product, and he realized right off the bat that he was going to need a new finance talent specifically for that service business, just because he did not have anybody to help manage that. And then for competition, the other thing is, you're looking at this and going through it. This is often where kind of the build versus buy or the M&A world starts to play. or even making divestitures. So as I walk through this process, trying to think about, where is it that we're going to have to buy, in terms of particular, as I looked at our competition, that is there any way for us to catch up, or are we going to have to go buy something to make that happen? The last phase for me, this is really, all about delivery, is talking about, and I guess I'll do the first one. The focus for me here was kind of the strategy and tactics, what we want to take to market and how we want to sell it. That to me is a little bit of our strategy. This is the nuts and bolts of the tactics and where really kind of the rubber meets the road for me. And it was all about starting with kind of where is our operation infrastructure. And quite frankly, I always found it very enlightening when I listen to the salesperson and they talk about, well, here's what the client wants, and yeah, we can deliver it. And I'm sure we can deliver it in 30 days. That's not a problem. And then you walk over and talk to the people running the operations, and they look at you like an Aztec at or a virgin at an Aztec festival. They're wondering like they're ready to kill you. And they tell you could do it in 30 days. And then I also spend time with the IT folks around the IT. How much will it take? The app dev group. Can we build the platform or should we buy it? These are the types of questions that I want. The team required. Do you have a core to build on? You're going to have to bring somebody in. So again, for the service business example and the manufacturing going to service, they were basically making a plan to hire a person to run a new division, and they were going to have to build that out as an entire brand new business and team. Okay. And then, the financial risk and capital, as you're listening to all these things, this is exactly the stuff that Tom was talking about, like where does cash come in? How do you finance this thing? What are the types? You're going to start to see, okay, if this is really where we want to go, what does it really take? And I think, for example, one of the groups I worked in, we were doing a big expansion into Latin America. And while on paper it made a lot of sense and it was very interesting, once we set it up, it was really, I guess what really surprised me, it wasn't the cost to set up, it was the cost to maintain Latin America and keep it running, and how much cash did they need, and how much work did, the compliance that we need to keep that running. I guess I was really surprised from how much more it took. And then, lastly, one of the questions that, and this actually I got from one of the startups I was out, we were pitching to a big VC, this is probably like 5-6 years ago, and he asked the question about what's the governor on growth? And at first I didn't really get what his point was, but subsequently, now that I've done it, it's really, I think, a great question to ask yourself after you finish. And so, for example, in the service business, right, keeping you the same example, a service business is driven by the people that you have and the ability to deliver that service. That's your governor on growth, right? That's a perfect example. And so, in particular for the business we're talking about in manufacturing, is very specific manufacturing, so finding the people that could service it were very important. People that could do the delivery. You'll find that, for many software companies, their biggest challenge is implementation of their software after they sell it, so they generally turn to partners. But can the partners, even, as you look to what partners you have, do they have the right resources to implement your product so it's set up right, and et cetera? So it's a big challenge. But also what I find is that if you don't figure out what that governor for growth is early and start planning for it and when you're going to get to a point in your growth curve and you're going to hit that thing, and getting around it can be really, really expensive. And so that's probably one of the things that I've discovered, in some of my past businesses as we grew and were able to make great sales. Delivering was very difficult, typically around finding the right people to make it work. And the one thing, again, I'd say from a financial perspective as you're going through this, I think that my experiences with people I've worked with, my teammates, is that most finance people have a great sense for a business case, and so I think you'll build a very nice, even-handed case as you pull this together. And as you review it, you'll find that you're going to see things that perhaps you didn't see before. And so that was probably the again, working with my team, that we really felt like we actually got a much better understanding of the business, but even kind of being realistic around what we needed to do from a finance team. So there's 2 more columns in this grid that I filled in, and so we start here. I'll just use the example, talent management needs to be global, and then that my workforce is going to be remote and mobile in the future. So I'm offering a talent management product, so this is something that we need to do. So therefore, I'm going to need to be able to analyze, new market development. That's something I'm going to have to do as finance support, right? And so what I'm going to need here is somebody that understands how that's done, the analysis around product expansion. So I'm just making a very simple example. So if I take this, just move this over, that the last two columns in this is identifying where I stand today. And when I did this with my team, we would go through and identify what do we have today. And so in this example, I'd say I have analysis primarily around month end. That's where when I look at my analysis, is the analysis of operational results, not so much on new business, but it was something we decided we could train on, right? So ultimately you finish it by just doing your initial assessment. And again, take your gut's generally best to get you started, and then you work through this, and I'll talk through that in a second. So the one thing when I talk about your support, always trying to remember what's near term versus future, just to help yourself time it. It's important, I think, too, as you walk in the next, is the trainer hire is also, it relates to initial assessment of your team. And the next slide I'll talk about training, but I think the near term, far term depends on whether or not you actually, in terms of how much time you have to train somebody. When I came to hire versus train versus hire, one of the things I would say is that I looked at it and said, look, how does someone get that skill? So a perfect example for us is that when I was in a travel business and we decided to go start selling in the U.S. federal government, right? So if anybody that's here that's ever sold into the GSA, it's like a whole separate language and world. And so we just realized that there was no way for us to train that. You would need someone that really grew up or had spent a lot of time in that business. So our immediate decision right away was that we were going to have to hire in someone around that GSA from top to bottom. And then lastly, the way that I wrapped this up was once I got this all together, and again, I just used this structure really to capture all my own notes, but it was just to capture all the business elements, that I would sit down with my immediate team and our HR rep, and we basically walk through it, and we just talk it line by line and figure out really where we had gaps, where do we see what the needs were going to be, when did we think we really need them, where did we have gaps, where was our current skills, and in Quintus, he gave us a much better and richer picture than I think we had before. But what we really had at the end was we had everything we needed then when we started the talent management process. When they would say, what is your object? How are you going to support the strategy? We could go to this and we knew exactly what we were talking about. They would talk about, well, what kind of skills are you going to need? Well, we went here and we had everything we needed. So the next step in terms of as you go through is deciding how do you build your team. And so when it came to training, we used kind of 4 steps to talk about whether or not we could train, or not. The first was deciding the urgency and whether or not we just had time. So the regulatory example, that was something that was going on. Another example for me was I used to work for the Royal Bank of Canada and their U.S. Wealth Management Division. And so due to regulatory changes from the SEC, our group that determined what products were available to our client base had to change. We had a really talented young analyst in that group supporting that team, but based upon the regulatory requirements coming down, we needed to change somebody. So we moved that person in and moved somebody over into that role from internally, thankfully, but because we had such an urgency to get something done that we just didn't have time. So that was really our first look. The second, and this takes a little time, but I think, and you don't have to do it across someone's entire skill base, but maybe in particular areas you go through it, but it's hard to train somebody if they think they already know it, okay? And so, so we had the team do a self-assessment of their skills, and really what it did was for themselves was really get them figured out whether they really had the experience they thought they did. And oftentimes I think many of us have been in that spot where someone will come to you and say, I'm ready to get promoted, and you say, why? And they say, well, I've been here 3 years. And you're like, okay, well that's, there's this, right? The time and there's an experience, right? So doing the self-assessment helped kind of ground where they were today. It also helped kind of validate my assessment, but again, if we were going to train, we just needed to make sure they were ready to be trained, that they knew they needed to be trained. The next was trying to decide if we had all the right opportunities to train somebody, kind of how we could get it done, right? And so it's either third party or hands-on, and try to figure out what's the most realistic. So last year, interesting enough, so one of the groups that I worked with is the revenue recognition team within our company, and there's some obviously anybody that's worked on RevRec, I always say it's simple concepts with complex implementation. And so for them, we knew there's new areas of RevRec, and third-party training was perfect to do that. Go teach them, understand how it works. Often doing SEC reporting and stuff like that, it works very well. But in the other case, you look at it and say, well, do we have enough hands-on opportunities? And when I did it at the Royal Bank, we had a lot of people who wanted to do M&A work, and we were doing tons of it. So we had more than enough opportunities to basically bring people in and help them get involved with M&A deals and show them how the deal was done. So we did have a lot of hands-on in that example. But other times they weren't. So again, going back to that first one with the manufacturing person building on the service company, there was not, they didn't have anything in-house. There was really no service-based analysis. They were doing lots of cost accounting, et cetera, work in progress, but nothing around services. And then the last thing, and these two are somewhat related, that what we tried to make sure is understand is you're going to spend the time and invest the money in training to somebody, figure out where their goals were for themselves, and to see whether or not they were interested. Ultimately, I think the best performance happens when it's something that they're interested in and they're really willing to learn. So trust me, I learned this one the hard way. I did a bunch of training for people that really weren't interested in it, and so I had missed this step in one of my first attempts. And so I think you don't necessarily have to do a full career plan, but really get a sense of the people that you want to put to that training. Where do they want to take their career? So does adding this in to their experience set, is this going to be worth it for them and for you? As far as hiring goes, the other thing that this grid for us really did well, so again, when you think of talent management and what do you want to do, what we did is as we started to hire, the easiest thing for us is like help HR to help you. Going back up to my initial comments from my friend Cindy was, you understand finance, what the nuances are. So we kind of moved away. We did a bunch of hiring, and we moved away really from job descriptions, and we really just focused on what the skills were and then what priority we wanted that person to have them. And so we would say whether it was analysis or accounting skills, et cetera. And then what we gave to our HR when they went and started recruiting was we said, okay, look, for every recruit that you bring in, here are the specific questions that we want you to ask, right? We gave them exact questions so we could help judge the talent. So then by the time they came to us, we actually had a pre-qualified pool of candidates we could work from. And then lastly, what we did to help them search is we actually, as we went through on the grid, we filled in kind of, if we were going to hire, anytime we marked hire, we'd say, okay, what are the titles, industry roles that are would be the developer to utilize the skills that we're looking for. So again, giving to our HR team, look, go hire, here's the 5 companies you should go talk to, here's the roles that you should probably be looking for, the types of titles, and that's really where they started. And now with like LinkedIn, it's that's like really great in terms of if you've got premium LinkedIn in terms of a recruiting tool, because you can look at people's titles, et cetera. But this, I'll tell you, this process into my working relationship with HR went up about 200% when we started this process, because prior to this, we'd say, okay, I want a senior analyst or a manager, and I'd end up getting a whole bunch of resumes, and then it was up to me to sort through them. I'd spend all this time trying to just look at those resumes at night or whatever, and I never felt like, quite frankly, I ever gave the resumes enough justice to really look at them. And then, you go through the process. So this actually, I felt like when we put this into place, really helped us, and that was just an offshoot of kind of putting that grid together. But again, I did have an HR person and asked someone to be assigned as I did this and went through that with them. And it actually getting that person involved, the HR team involved with me in this process really helped as well. So a little success story. So out doing this, and I found out in talking to our sales team that the company that I work for, they had a variety of interests that they owned. They own this business in Latin America. Now it's going to be rolled under our division, right? These are a bunch of autonomous businesses operating in Colombia, Peru, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, all on their own. Never really had, kind of just operating. They're owned by this company, but never brought in. And the big thing for us was, as a company, we had pretty significant debt covenants and cash requirements, et cetera. And so integrating, now that we're going to have to own this business and fund it, integrating them with us to understand their cash needs, et cetera, was pretty significant, right? So we started looking at, what was the type of person that we would need to run this. And, ironically, as we went through the steps and did the career plan, one of the people popped up, and I had never known this before, that they had traveled and worked and wanted to work with the Latin American team. So they had like a high interest. And so we kind of mapped this person's role, interest back to the fact that they had, we needed someone with a strong accounting background. We wanted someone, quite frankly, that had a little bit of an audit background, because it would help with that capital and risk and helping make sure the processes got put through and integrated them. But, I mean, the punchline of the joke really is that, I was thinking about the CFOs and these guys down in Latin America. Here they have been running completely on their own. These are like, businesses anywhere between 100 million to 250 million, always just kind of running on their own, never really reported to anybody except, they send the month-end reports up to the board. And now they had to be part of all our processes and procedures, and we're subject to all of our regulatory requirements. We're the same for them. And so having this person that we served as our go-between between them, we weren't going to run their businesses for them, but we just needed to get them integrated. It took that entire worry of integration, for them off their plate, quite frankly, because we gave them the roadmap on how to get there. The other thing I would say, that the other benefits I found by going through this process was that during the discovery, there was a huge impact on my team that came through that. I guess the best way to put it was we produced less data and more information, okay? Because everybody, now that they understood the business better, they got out there and were talking to people, they realized a lot of the information that we produced really didn't fit. It was probably directionally correct, but we were able to change it quite a bit to make it much more specific to what the operators needed and when they needed it. A big example, we found that we were asked, when we go through this approval process, we would ask for approvals well before they actually knew the information in the field, right? So then we'd always have to go back and revise our approvals, and we always wondered, God, why don't they understand that? So once we got out there, we realized that we had just kind of missed the mark, right? But so what was fascinating to me, and then without really any involvement from myself, was all of a sudden our month-end reporting, the bunch of the things that we had done just started to change because our team understood the business more. When we did the talent assessment, the big thing here is that, obviously there's no unlimited training budget. Anybody that's got one, let me know. It'd be great to find out one company that ever had one. But we were able to consolidate our training needs. So instead of individually, as we decided with our staff, we looked at it. So we actually invested bringing in, at times, we brought in an outside party to do specific training for our team around different areas. The self-assessment, again, the visibility, that was probably the biggest benefit for us, was getting people to see where they really stood at that point in time was huge in terms of making a benefit. And then career planning, the thing that helped me the most was it avoided a lot of holes. Not that people would always tell me where they were going to go, but quite honestly, I had a much better view of when people were going to leave. I would look at where we were going, looked at what their career plan was, and I could put the math together between what I saw where the business was going and what they wanted to do, and I could see that this was going to be a long-term fit for them, or it was not going to be a long-term fit for them. So I really spent, that for me, I think helped a lot, that we were much more planful in our transition among our staff levels was really good. And we didn't, because I think the first, I worked for Carlson Wagonlit Travel, and like the first year when I took over running part of the financial analysis team, I had several people leave, and we really hadn't planned for it. So for 6 or 8 weeks, it was just horrible, because you had this huge hole, and you didn't have a huge team, and so you'd have a huge hole you had to fill. So, but once we actually went through this process with the team, we actually were able to be much more planful and never, kind of did a big cross training. So when someone would leave, it was much less of an impact for us, which I think was pretty good. So I think that is it. And so I've left time enough to do some questions here. So, oh wait, so is my contact on here? There it is. So a couple things in terms of before I open the floor to questions. If you have other questions, what I'd encourage you to do, and the same thing that John said today, is go ahead on the Performative, put it on the site, ask a question, and we can start a dialogue around it and give people a share. But if you're interested too, feel free to shoot me an email. Always happy to follow up. I've done a number of webinars on Performative and have talked to people after the fact and just answer questions, et cetera. It's obviously we'll fit it into our schedules when we can. So with that, happy to go back. Any questions at all on what I've covered today?
Mark, when you were engaging on HR, was that something that you put on the CEO when I engaged that nature? They were on board from the top, and as far as working on HR, were they generally receptive to you coming out and reaching out to the team along the process?
Yeah. If you start, so the question was, how do we approach HR and what was HR's response? I think the answer is that HR was very happy because, again, they run the talent management process. And by going through this and creating the content that would go into it, they were very, very excited about it. But also, HR is no different. I mean, every finance person wants to be involved with the business more. HR is the exact same way. So by inviting them in to participate with this, I think that they were very excited. But I think for me personally, I actually ended up getting more benefit out of it than I anticipated because I felt like I got much better service from my HR team because they really knew what they needed to do for us. Instead of giving me, again, no different than the data that I sent out to the operators that they couldn't use, they weren't giving me things that I couldn't use either. So they kind of so actually the HR team kind of changed their cadence of how they work with us as well. So I think that really helped.
What tools did you use for giving your employees self-assessment?
For the self-assessment, I used a couple of tools worked with our HR team, but they had their, there's a couple of them that they used. And there was one in particular that we had put together. Gosh, I can't remember I had one that I built on my own where I just developed, I listed the kind of the roles of in finance, and I asked them to basically kind of give themselves a rating. And then another we used an outside firm where they had kind of an assessment tool, a financial assessment tool. So it depends. I asked my HR team when they had something, we used that. If we didn't, I just used the one that I created on my own. And actually, on the site for Performative Site, a version of that, I have a tool that's called the CFO versus controller, kind of what role fits in where. I mean, ultimately, every company decides what the CFO role is, but it was something similar to that. And so we basically have people walk through the different functions and say, where do you feel like you've been strong or not? And so for some people, as we went through, they found, they had a very narrow window of scope. But that's a tool that you could, use. Any other questions?
So as you went through this self-assessment process, did you come across situations where the employee actually, there were gaps between your perception and the employee's perception of the skills, and how did you deal with those?
So the question was, how do we deal with gaps in perception when people did their self-assessments versus what we saw? And we had tons of them. I mean, especially the first time we did it, I think every employee had one somewhere. And the way we approached it was talked about, we really broke it down between what's your exposure to a skill and what's your experience with the skill, right? So where would you have been just exposed to it and versus where were you really actually leading it? And that was kind of my difference. And talked about the level of depth that you get based upon the roles that they had. So, one guy thought he was well-versed in M&A. And I was like, well, look, you've always been kind of running analysis around M&A. That's true. But in terms of really leading and understanding an M&A, very different story. And so as he looked at it, I think he was thinking about, I have lots of experience in running the one analysis around M&A, but as far as the bigger picture, how do you integrate it, what you do with it after the case, then he understood then. So I think what we did is looked at it and said, based upon the roles that you've had, here's the likely experience that you've got. And now again, sometimes we learn things, but typically speaking, that's how we looked at and developed, helped them just walk through kind of, again, comparing what was your exposure to an item versus when did you really own it and when did you really run it. That was probably the flip based upon the roles that they had. Any other?
How do you assess career motivation with your employees? They know they may not give you the full truth. How do you get that out of them?
Well, I got it out of them by two ways. So first, by having them for someone that when they want to do the career plan, and what I found first was that people, everyone told me they wanted a career plan, but then people didn't do it, right? So it was a real question, were they really motivated themselves to actually work on their career? But I think where it really came out to is as we looked at career planning, and someone said, okay, I really want to decide, one person come to me and say, boy, I really want to be involved with the field and pricing, and I want to be on deals all the time. So we moved them over into that opportunity, and then within very short order, kind of what they wanted versus what they really wanted came out, right? In terms of that level of responsibility and the responsiveness that you needed to work with the field, was very different from what they said they wanted. So there was that just by putting them into that role, you found that. But then lastly, if someone was not being honest with me, I guess, is where I would say as I actually started putting them into training or the roles, it was pretty easy to me to see whether or not they were responding or not. So if they weren't responding or weren't really putting a lot of time and effort into it, that's when I felt like, okay, what they said over here and what they're really doing, it just showed by their behavior. Okay.
How do you manage the situation, say, by CEO expects the team to support the players, but on the other hand, the reality is some people see there's goals of that in a way. There's a gap between the CEOs and the whole organization.
So the question was kind of A, B, C players and how you deal if you've got a bunch of C players on your team. Is that kind of the question? So in one of the areas, I can't say I had it universally. I was actually pretty lucky to get some good players. But I had a number of C players that, as we started working with them, our first, again, you want to try and help people find the right spot for them and help train them and get them started. So we would try and invest some training and just see how they responded. But I think the real thing and why most people are, quite frankly, C players are because they're just in the wrong spot. I think that their interest, what they're really interested in and what they're doing are two different things. And so I think by doing kind of that self-assessment, it almost helped them see where they needed to be, and then the career planning, it helped them understand where they needed to go. So I think, again, most of my C players really were just that they were just in the wrong spot, is most of it. But with those people where we found they just didn't have the skill set, ultimately there were people that we just had to let go because we didn't have an unlimited budget to carry people, but we needed the talent. So there were people we just replaced. We just replaced their position. It wasn't easy, but it was, the expectation we had to deliver. So.
I think it's true when you bring in a third party, somebody who's going to be really engaging and effective in training.
Say that again.
How do you find a good third party trainer?
How do you find a good third-party trainer? I asked, when we talked to different trainers, I asked them who they used or who they presented to, and then I just called those companies. I just used it by personal reference. How did you see it? And if they had videos, most people now, the beautiful part is a lot of good trainers will have videos that they're training on, so you can go see it. But personally, I just called people and said, how effective was it? And did you see anything? Did anything happen after they did the training? So yes, that moment they trained was interesting, but then what happened afterwards, right? So it was more of, I tried to find out what happened afterwards. Anything else? Otherwise, I think Jason or we probably had time. Okay. One more question? Anybody?
How involved was the HR person, even if they're cooperative? How involved were they and knowledgeable about your business in order that when they answer your questions, they could understand the answers?
So the question is, how knowledgeable was HR? Because we gave them the questions and we coached them, so when we were having them recruit for us, we said, here's the questions and here's kind of the answers that you want to look for, and we basically just so I walked through it with my team and said, okay, here's the question I want you to ask, and then I had one of my team members respond back and say, and here's a typical response you're going to get. But we basically, we walked them through and said, here's what you're looking for, here's the kind of key phrases, and here are things that you should be listening for, because again, we were trying to help at least, and this was really, quite frankly, for us, just a way for us to whittle down the pile of resumes that we had to go through, was by just getting it down just to a smaller subset and having what we found is quite frankly, a much more qualified pool of candidates to pull from. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your time today.